Okay, today's featured author, Libby Copeland, will be introduced and interviewed by Jennifer Mendelsohn. A few months ago, many of you had the pleasure of watching Libby interview author Danny Shapiro. If you missed that webinar or any of our previous author webinars, you can watch them on our TTN NYC YouTube channel. Jennifer Mendelsohn is a seasoned journalist and ghostwriter whose work has appeared in numerous local and national publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, People, Slate, and USA Today. A native Long Islander, now based in Baltimore, Mendelsohn serves on the board of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Maryland and is the administrator of Facebook's Jewish Genetic Genealogy Group. A member of the Association of Professional Genealogists and frequent lecturer, she is the creator of the movement known as Resistance Genealogy, a project that uses genealogical and historical records to fight disinformation and honor America's immigrant past. Her work has received international media attention, including being featured on CNN, MSNBC, The New Yorker, and The Washington Post. Jennifer, it's all yours, but I hope you'll share with the audience what happened when you turned 50.
Sure, thank you so much. I think what Debbie means is that we can maybe talk later that my genealogical career was sort of a second career for me after a long career in journalism, and it sort of hit its stride the year that I turned 50. So it all comes full circle. So I guess it's appropriate that I'm here. And I have the great pleasure of introducing my friend, Libby Copeland. Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, The New York Times, The New Republic, Esquire.com, and The Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published in March by Abrams Press. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, "Before you spit in that vial, read this book." The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? And are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? Well, that's a tall order, but with that, please welcome Libby Copeland.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm happy to be in front of this audience again, because this is like an amazing audience. And I'm very excited to be with Jennifer, who is in many ways the fairy godmother of The Lost Family. And we've been talking about some of these themes and concepts and questions about human nature for several years since the book originally came to be and before it came to be. So it's a real treat to be here with you, Jennifer.
Thanks. Same. So why don't we talk about that fairy godmother bit and start by, how did this book come to be? How did you end up writing a book about commercial DNA testing and the crazy consequences that it can have?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for a little over 20 years, and I spent half my career at the Washington Post, and then I moved up to New York, and I write for a variety of publications from New York. The last few years I had gotten more and more into science writing, and the stories that had always appealed to me even before science writing were always these sort of questions of identity, people's intimate lives. Working at the Washington Post, in the feature section, there was a lot of stories that revolved around what I think of as access journalism, right? So you've got, you're in a hotel room with a celebrity for an hour and you have to create a profile that's riveting that no one's ever read before about Matt Damon, right? Or you're following along John McCain on his, 2008 presidential run, and you're hoping that he says something interesting to you that he doesn't say to the rest of the press corps, which, And so the stories that I like to do the best at the Washington Post were like the kind of subterranean stories, the unknown stories, the ones where, you're not talking to someone famous, but you're talking to someone who should be famous because they're interesting, because their story is riveting, and they're an ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances. And these questions of how we form ourselves and what influences us, what shapes our moral sense and our point of view and our perspective, those were always interesting to me. And then it all came together, this interest in science and this interest in people's personal lives and intimate motivations, because I was in conversation with my editor at the Washington Post a few years ago, who knows Jennifer. And Jennifer and she had been talking as well. And Jennifer, who does genetic genealogy and knows this world, said to my editor, someone really should start writing about this sort of unexpected consequences of DNA testing and, the way that it can change people's lives. And my editor came to me and said, does this interest you? And I said, well, yes, it does. And I cast about to try to find a story that was really compelling. And I found a story that was like so unbelievably unusual and sort of striking in its surprising outcome, but in sort of held within it many other stories. So I felt like it told a lot of stories in one. And it kind of grappled with some of these essential questions of identity. And I wrote that story for the Washington Post. It ran in 2017. It was the tale of a woman who thought she was Irish. She took a test through a company called Ancestry. She learned that she was half Ashkenazi Jewish. And the story of how that happened, how she came to get her story wrong, and how that unexpected genetic ancestry was part of her family. That story of kind of mystery, of her uncovering that mystery, was really compelling. And so that story runs, and it gets a lot of viral pickup, and it gets reprinted in the United States and elsewhere abroad. And I start getting emails from people, and they are like emails by the hundreds. I'm very quickly underwater. I'm unable to respond to all of them. And Jennifer, this world longer and better than I, because you obviously work with people and hear tens of thousands of stories. There are practically, I would say, well over 1 million at this point for sure. And how the range of them and their parallels, and also how each one is different. I started hearing from people who took a DNA test because they were curious about their family history. They thought of it as a kind of a recreation, a form of entertainment. It was so cheap, it was on sale, I got it as a gift. And they discovered something they weren't looking for. And then they found themselves with a kind of a profound moment of, what now? And that journey was very interesting to me. And as I heard these stories over and over from people across all kind of demographic walks of life, I felt like this is not a story just about one group of people or one generation. This is a kind of a seismic cultural change. This is a change to America, right? And I wanted to make it into a book, and that was how it all started.
Well, I can tell you that, from my end, so I had lunch with my friend Amy, who's an editor at the Washington Post, and I was telling her, like, oh my God, this world is so rife with amazing human drama. You have to do something. I forgot all about that conversation. And I remember very clearly, I was at the International Jewish Genealogy Conference in Orlando, and the Washington Post came out, and I read this story, and I was like a crazy person running around telling everyone, like, you have to read this story. It just was like jaw-dropping, and it was so exciting for me to see it come back. And I thought, oh my God, I think I set this in motion. It was, well, hopefully people will buy the book and read the story. So let's talk about Alice, who is the heroine of your book and the sort of core of your book. And obviously, without giving away the incredible turn of events that led to Alice getting that very surprising DNA result. Tell me about Alice and telling Alice's story.
Yeah, so Alice was the subject of the Washington Post piece, and then I decided to expand it for the book. And I expanded it, and then I told many, many, many other stories. Some of those stories were from people who reached out to me after the Alice story ran in the Washington Post. And the beauty of getting to write her story into a book was that I could expand on it greatly, and I could do historical research that went back a century to the beginnings of her genetic mystery. So Alice is this really smart woman. She's in her early 70s. She was in her 60s at this point when the story begins back in 2012. She's a retiree. She's a technological maven, and she's someone who spent her career working with data. So she, that part of her brain, the part of my brain that doesn't operate, that part of her brain is like on fire. So she really understands how to take vast quantities of data and kind of organize them. And that's literally what she spent her career doing, was wrestling data into something that made sense. So why am I telling you this? She takes this test in 2012. She gets this unexpected DNA result where she's, instead of being entirely Irish, she's half Ashkenazi Jewish and the other half is Irish. And she very methodically sets out to investigate her own origins and understand how this could be, right? The most common explanation, the most likely explanation for her scenario has got to be that she is the product of a non-paternity event. Now, non-paternity event is a word that's used within the genetic genealogy world. Sometimes it's called a not parent expected or misattributed parentage experience. But it's the experience of finding out one or both of your parents, typically your dad, is not genetically related to you. And it's common enough that if you have taken a test, it may happen to you. It's definitely not the majority, but if you're in this world or you're on a Facebook group where other people are doing it, you'll see NPE a lot, and that's a non-paternity event. You'll see a lot of people discovering that. So she investigates that possibility because it is so likely, and it turns out not to be the explanation in her case. It's also not the explanation that any of the more likely scenarios, that could come to play are the ones that provide the explanation for her case. So she's not adopted, which is a scenario she investigates. She's not donor conceived, as Danny Shapiro discovered had happened in her own story, in her own genetic origin story. She's not coming from a group of people who hid their genetic ancestry. So she investigates the possibility that she could have come from Irish Jews, or maybe Jews who pretended to be Irish when they came over. And you do hear stories of people who convert or assimilate their way out of one genetic ancestry or one ethnic identity into another. Not just Jews, but African Americans, if they're light-skinned enough to pass, sometimes make that choice to escape rampant discrimination in past decades. So you do hear those stories, but that's not the explanation for Alice. And it turns out her mystery goes back 100 years, and the pleasure of understanding it and kind of researching it was one of the great pleasures of writing the book. But in order to solve her mystery, she has to organize her data. What she does is she tests at every company that she can. She tests all, there's 7 Collins siblings. So she comes from the Collins family. They're a large Irish Catholic family, so that she makes sure they're all tested in as many databases as possible. And then she looks at their genetic cousins. So when you take a DNA test, you're getting your ethnicity estimate pie chart, which is where your folks come from, anywhere from, say, 500 to 1,000 years ago, and you're getting your list of DNA relatives. And those are people who've tested at the same company and show up as matching to you through the company's, processing algorithms. They can tell, through overlapping genetic segments, who in the system is closely related to you. So she takes all those people and all those overlapping genetic segments, and she attempts to make sense of them. And she has spreadsheets, and she works for 2.5 years to understand through math, basically, through math and science, how her family got its story so wrong. And so that journey, it's unbelievable. And you and I have talked about this, 1 in a million people would have had the skill set, the patience, the curiosity, and the doggedness, and the time to do this. And she's absolutely amazing. She's also very funny and warm. And so, I got to fly out to Washington State for the book and spend time with her and sit with her in her kind of madcap sewing room / office while we ate like M&Ms and peanuts. And she just showed me her numbers, and I couldn't believe it. It was amazing.
Well, I think, that story in and of itself is just extraordinary. But interestingly, the book is not just the story of Alice. So I think we need a little bit of context because clearly Alice is not the only person who has had an
Right.
experience like this. So can you sort of, for people who may not be familiar and have only seen, the Ancestry commercial where you trade your, lederhosen for a kilt, what sorts of surprises are people finding, and how widespread a phenomenon is this?
Right. So yeah, great questions. The industry of recreational DNA testing has been around for just over 20 years. It was founded in 2000. But for the first 10 years, the type of DNA that was being tested was different than what we're looking at now. So what we're looking at now is called autosomal DNA, and that's the DNA testing that's going to give you those ethnicity estimate pie charts and your lists of genetic relatives. So there have been over 35 million DNA test kits sold at this point. The majority of them are in the United States. It's probably somewhere around 8% of the US population. There might be a little overlap, it might be a little less, it might be a little more. So that's a significant proportion of the US population. The vast majority of people who test are going to find out something that is not earth-shattering, right? And so, I've had that experience, and it's just this incredible, intense depth of understanding about who you are. If you're lucky, if you're not lucky, you're going to look at your results and say, these don't make any sense. They're exactly what I expect, and I don't know what else to do with it. And then you walk away, right? Because it's like a little bit of a challenge, and you kind of have to dig in and have the time. In my case, everything I found was consistent with what I expected in terms of understanding already my parents' genetic ancestry. Nothing in my immediate family was surprising, but it greatly deepened my understanding of the past. And it took me back, in some cases, over 100 years in terms of understanding my family history. So it was an incredible gift. And I think that's true for a lot of people. There's a subset of people, a minority, that are going to discover something is not what they thought. And it could be, maybe in their grandparents' generation, or it could be something much more immediate. So there are people who are discovering, for instance, they're not genetically related to their dad. That is probably one of the most common. For sure, it's one of the most common. It may be the most common. The other kind of big bucket is discovering that you have a sibling or a half sibling you didn't know about. That can come about because you're discovering that you're not genetically related to dad, and there's some other man out there who contributed half your genetic material, and he has 2 children, and you're discovering they're your half siblings. But it could also come about because, say, one of your parents had a child before your parents got together. Another bucket of discovery is people discovering that they're adopted, or people discovering that they're donor conceived, particularly folks who are from older generations, so that these were times when parents might not have told, for a variety of reasons, the truth of their genetic origins to their children. And then, of course, hidden genetic ancestry, which is probably much less common. But if you put them all together, if it's in the low single digits, which I think is a conservative estimate, it's at least 1 million people. But I will say I think the phenomenon is much more widespread than that, and I'll tell you why. Because each person who makes a discovery that they, for instance, are not genetically related to their dad, that person is then making a discovery that has an impact on, say, conservatively speaking, 8 to 10 people, right? Because the discovery that you're not genetically related to dad has implications not just for you, but for dad, for your mom's relationship with dad, for your siblings who you are suddenly discovered they're genetically half siblings. Then across town or across the country, there's some other family that you are now discovering you are genetically related to. There is a man who you are related to who is your genetic father. He has children. Those children are now your half siblings. This discovery may have implications for his relationship with his wife, right? So there's this kind of like ripple effect. And the ways in which these discoveries play out, the then decisions to reach out, the overtures, the responses to those overtures, the question of how do I craft a letter to my genetic father? These are incredibly important questions that a lot of Americans are sort of now just waking up to having to to answer for themselves. And they're often answering them somewhat by themselves in these kind of siloed moments of discovery where they're like, oh my God, what now? Where do I go? Like, who do I turn to? Where do I go? Has this happened to anyone else? Maybe they've heard of it happening. Maybe they haven't. Maybe they're so ashamed and embarrassed that they don't want to really reach out and tell other people. And it's and that was one of the things that I wanted to explore in the book. You know, like what does it look like to reach out? Why do people respond the way that they do? When it works out, why does it work out? If you can say, although these situations are so complicated, and how does this shape and reshape the human heart? Because these are really, really intimate stories, and these, you know, ultimately these are questions about family, about love, about identity, about what we consider family and what we consider ethnicity too, right? How do we define these things? And so when I was interviewing people, and I would interview them once for hours, and then again 6 months later for several hours, and then again another year later, right, to see how their stories changed. There were these long kind of moving interviews with people who were really meditating on these questions about selfhood, and every person answering them, you know, differently and for themselves. And I found that process of interviewing those people who were trying to understand themselves in such intimate ways, I found that to be such a privilege. You know, I just think we're in this really extraordinary moment. And it was like just absolutely incredible to get to talk to people who were actively thinking through these questions for themselves.
So a lot of the stories in the book, and you know, the stories you were just talking about, have to do with sort of the psychological ramifications for people. It can be incredibly, you know, the word unmoored is used a lot. People feel very unmoored when they learn that they are not biologically related to their family of origin. But there are also a lot of sort of practical implications. Can you talk about like the story of like Linda Minton and the health consequences of these discoveries, which I found really fascinating and scary?
Yeah, Linda and I she literally emailed me like yesterday, like we're still in touch, and her story is so incredible and it's still playing out. And so she updates me on it, and she's incredible. Linda lives on the West Coast, and she was adopted and nobody told her. And she went through her entire life not knowing that she was adopted. And at the age of 51, she was experiencing some medical issues that led her and her doctor to think that she might have ovarian cancer. And it was a combination of symptoms, and she was experiencing some pain. This was combined with some tests that they did. Then it was further combined with her understanding of her genetic ancestry and her family health history. So, you know, when you're sort of deciphering the risk factor, you're taking a lot of things into account. And the fact that Linda was, she believed, half Ashkenazi Jewish through her mother, her doctor felt elevated her risk. And they went ahead and they did the radical hysterectomy. But it was a couple of weeks later, she had taken an ancestry DNA test because she was trying to better understand her genetic ancestry and her potential health risks. And it didn't come back till after the hysterectomy. And when it came back after the hysterectomy, that's when she realized gradually, looking at her ethnicity estimate and her DNA relatives, that in fact, she wasn't half Ashkenazi Jewish, and that in fact, she was adopted. And this was something that her mother had not told her. Her brothers hadn't told her. Her close relative, who was a good friend, hadn't told her, because everyone was keeping the secret because of a decision that had been made 50 years before. And you see that over and over with secrets, that they have this propulsive power, this inertia, that, you know, that they may have made sense in a completely different context. Putting aside Linda's situation, because I think it's unusual. In general, a decision to keep a secret about a child's genetic origins, you know, a child who was conceived 60 years ago, those often made sense in the context of the time. in the context of a culture that might have shunned a family, that might have outcast a family, that might have punished a mother, that might have shamed a father for being infertile. And yet you find that at least I found that the culture, right, the culture changes rapidly in 50, 60 years, but the secret doesn't adapt. It stays, embedded in amber. And so all of a sudden you have people who are discovering that the truth of their genetic origins is radically different. And they're going to their moms and dads and they're saying, how could you not have told me? Right? I don't understand, because there's no longer this stigma to these things anymore. But there's just something about the power of secrets that they just sort of stay as they were. So, it turned out that Linda, may not have needed to have, she'll never know that she had this information before this surgery, but there's, it's very possible that if she'd had this information, she wouldn't have had to have the surgery. Mm. And she's still dealing with the after effects of, what it's done to her body. In addition to that, then she wanted to reach out and discover her maternal relatives and her father and her paternal relatives. She reached out to her genetic dad, and he basically said to her, listen, like, we've talked a couple times on the phone at this point, my wife's found out, these phone calls are getting me in trouble with my wife. I need some space. And so she was sort of unhappily unable to forge a relationship with him. She did manage to get in touch with some of her paternal siblings, and they, had varying degrees of openness towards her. Because often you find that these, the revelation of somebody who exists often will clash with a family's sacred narratives. And so it's a question of, am I going to welcome this stranger in? Am I going to trust their narrative of events? If you haven't looked at the results yourself, or you just think, I don't believe the science, whatever. People can be in denial about the results. And you may make a decision that your loyalty to your family and your understanding of your dad is, I want to keep things as they are. So this person coming in is considered very disruptive and they're shunned. And that's really heartbreaking for the person who's trying to kind of come into this situation. On her mom's side, Linda discovered when she researched her mom, her biological mom, that the woman had just died 6 months before. And there were certain questions that she had that she cannot have answered now. They were questions like, did she think of me? Did she look for me? And the reason she can't have them answered is because her biological mom apparently never told anybody, at least not her own children and her husband, that Linda existed. So going to them and saying, hey, can you answer these questions? Their response was, our mother just died. We're grieving for her. And your story is really, really upsetting to us. Please leave us alone. And I've said this before, but I think of it often. It's, this phrase, don't shoot the messenger, right? And that phrase means don't punish the person who's bringing you the news that's bad or problematic, because they had nothing to do with the news. They're just the messenger. If your circumstances of your life, or your life itself, your existence, your very existence, was a secret from your genetic family, then you wind up being made the messenger of your own existence. And in many families, not all of them for sure, but in many families, the overtures then that play out, and I describe many of them in the book, and I followed many people and families to try to understand how these things play out. In many, these people are met with rejection, with why are you doing this to us? What do you want? And that's really heartbreaking.
I feel like we should just take one moment and reiterate that these sort of problematic results are a very, very small subset of a real subset, and a real issue. But I feel obligated to say that like DNA testing can be amazing, and it can happily reunite families, and it can be used in all sorts of wonderful and positive ways and answer all sorts of genealogical questions that nothing else can answer. So it's a double-edged sword. But
and
I do think,
want to say, I'm sorry, I just want to say that what I agree with you absolutely, and that there are many people, in fact, the majority of people I've interviewed who discovered something surprising were grateful to know, which seems weird, right? You'd say, well, it was painful and they were rejected, or it was painful and they were accepted, but it was still painful. People want to know the truth about themselves. But you're absolutely right. The majority of people are not discovering that they're not related to their dad. They are often discovering this incredible immediacy to the past. And that's what we discovered in our family. This kind of, good Lord, what access to the past we suddenly have. And it's not possible through paper records alone. Mm-hmm. You know, it's the power of the combination of the DNA with the paper records that gives you this like capacity to break through those brick walls. That's absolutely amazing.
As we have this conversation, I'm staring at a photograph on my ledge, and I think I have a great grandmother who died in 1904 at the age of 36, and there's not a single photograph of her. She is completely lost to history. But through DNA, I discovered that no one knew that she had a brother who lived in Chicago, and I now have a picture of her brother. And you know, it's stuff like that that can be like positive. I just wanted to make sure we didn't cast this all as, you know,
sure,
yeah. Oh my God, DNA is nefarious and, you know, wrecking everything. But I do want to talk about, you know, the subtitle of your book includes the word upending. You know, it's upending who we are. So I guess I wonder about, you know, so we have this technology that has now become commercially available, and it can have this sort of unintended huge consequence. And I guess I'm curious, both, what do you advise when people say, I want to take a DNA test? And B, where should that process be regulated, or should it be, or you know, who needs to sort of oversee this problematic result and unintended consequence of a tech, like, or is there no putting the genie back in the bag at this point?
Right.
Not
right.
Bag, bottle.
Yeah, bag or bottle.
Genies go in bottles, I believe.
Yeah. So
cats go in bags. That's what it is.
All right. So the question is, what was the second question was what should be done? And the first question is,
I forget.
That's okay. I'll answer the second question. So it's a really, you know,
what would you advise people?
What would you advise? So I kind of,
we are over 50.
Right. So I think of it as a kind of a twofold advice. One is that, you know, when you take a test through one of the major four companies, and the major four companies are, and this is sort of in descending order. So the largest database, I'm going to say first, and then you go down, and database size is relevant because the bigger the database, the more people have tested there, the more likely you are to find those genetic relatives, those close genetic relatives who help you understand your family history. So Ancestry is the biggest, then 23andMe, then MyHeritage, and then Family Tree DNA. And they're all in the millions, but some of them are in the 19 millions, like Ancestry, right? So when you test, you will typically see like a little advisory. And sometimes you'll see it a few times. And it will say something like, you may discover things about your family aren't what you expect. You know, like, are you sure? That advisory I found over and over, people don't assume will apply to them. There's a statistical possibility that you're in the minority of people who are going to have a surprise of some sort, but you assume that you know what there is to know, because it would be almost like a cognitive distortion to walk into a situation thinking, maybe I'm going to discover something that's totally unexpected, and it turns out that I'm adopted, right? That is not something any of us would foresee or predict. So it's possible that those advisories could be a little bit more kind of in your face. So for instance, 23andMe has, so 23andMe, as many people know, and as now increasingly other companies offer as well, health testing in addition to testing for ancestry purposes. And when you take a health test through 23andMe, if you want to find out some pretty not a big deal information, like about certain health risks or about your earwax type, you don't have to go jump through a lot of hoops to get it. But if you want to find out if you're at elevated risk of early onset Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, things that for which there may not be a cure, they make you go through an extra step of, are you sure? Right. And it's possible that could be that something like that, kind of an elevated step, could be something that could be helpful, or potentially making it a bit more obvious for people who just want to find out their ethnicity estimate and don't want to see their DNA relatives, because typically it's through the discovery of unexpected DNA relatives that a surprise is often found when it is found. Potentially, maybe that's an option for people. And I know genealogists might not like that because they want those matches in order to be able to do the research, but maybe that's one approach. But again, it's sort of hard to say if people will kind of pay attention to that. And so, my advice is pay attention to that, consider it, but know also that the context with which we're engaging with this technology doesn't necessarily allow for that kind of deep thought. I mean, I got my first test as a gift, right? So the stage at which there would have been an advisory, well, I skipped that first stage. I still got it again when I took the test. But, I was already engaging with it as entertainment. It had already been gifted to me. Like, that show was already kind of going down the road, to mix another metaphor. So that's potentially an issue. And so the other kind of piece of advice that I would give is that for those folks who are in the older generation, the generation that I think of as the secret keepers, who sometimes do know things about their children's genetic origins that they didn't tell their children, that it may just be a matter of time before an adult child tests, or somebody else tests in, like their child, in a way that makes that truth about their genetic identity known to them. Because in fact, in many situations, the person about whom the secret is being discovered themselves doesn't need to test, or a family surprise can come out without you directly testing, right? Maybe an aunt test or a first cousin. And so the information is increasingly not something that you can control, even if you choose not to test, and even if your child doesn't test. So it may be something where if you're in your 80s and you happen to know something, right, like that your child was conceived by sperm donor, this might be the moment to think about whether you tell that child the truth, right? Because over and over when I've interviewed people, I have found that they say they would rather have found out from the lips of somebody who loves them than from a computer screen, because there's something about it's very impersonal. You feel like your power has been usurped by this sort of computer screen delivering the information rather than getting it from somebody. And it's much harder to kind of control the message and deal with the aftermath for that older generation when it's coming to you in that direction. So I think it's much better, if possible. And now, of course, there's a cottage industry of people who are arising to help you with this and hold your hand, right? You might want to think about that messaging, and maybe you take it to your child before it comes out, before it leaks out by way of DNA testing.
Let's talk about that hand-holding process, because that to me is one of the most fascinating parts of all of this, that there's this sort of underground world of people navigating these kinds of surprises who have sort of found ways to come together and support one another. And it's pretty impressive.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And it's grown certainly by leaps and bounds, even, in the last few years.
Definitely.
So there's search angels, which is people who are generally volunteer, which is the angels part of it. And they're often people who worked on their own genetic genealogy. Maybe they were somebody who had been adopted and they were trying to find their birth mother. And then they have this knowledge from having been done genealogy and genetic genealogy for years and years, and they figured it out and they want to help somebody else. And so there's often folks on the many genetic genealogy Facebook groups. There's often files that exist there, as you, I know, are always reminding people to read the files when they ask a question everyone else has asked, right? This stuff has been laid out. It's in documents, techniques for how to make sense of your results and potentially find an immediate family member that's there. There are search angels to help you. There are administrators of Facebook groups to help, guide and give advice. There are people that you can hire as well. And there's now also a kind of a growing industry of psychologists. And this is something I really saw grow in the last year, because when I was finishing up my book, it was like very small. And then in the last year, I'm seeing more and more. I'm seeing there's a crisis helpline that you can call if you discover you're the product of an NPE. There's a couple of psychology networks for people who treat folks who've had an NPE. And of course, in this virtual world, often you can work with them virtually, like, even if they're in another state. And every psychologist that I know of who is working in this field of helping people with their DNA surprises is somebody who stumbled into it because they themselves took a DNA test and discovered almost always that they're the product of a non-paternity event. And they dealt with the fallout, and they dealt with the sense that maybe a typical psychologist without training in this didn't know how to help them in their specific situation. Some of them say that that some people say when they get a response like this, that they will sometimes go to a psychologist or a therapist, and their response will be, what's the big deal? Your dad's still your dad. But it's hugely meaningful to your sense of identity. It's hugely meaningful in terms of wanting to forge potentially relationships, not just with your dad, but with these siblings that that you missed out on. And there's often a process of this really complicated combination of gratitude and grief. And the grief is the loss of all those years, right? The fact that you can't get them back. And so those two things, the sort of the rise of search angels and genetic genealogists to help, and then the rise of the psychologists, means that, we're starting to develop a kind of an infrastructure, I guess, a kind of a grassroots infrastructure, I guess you would say, for the many, many people going through these situations.
Yeah. So I think we'll have one more question, if that seems right. But I'm going to remind people that then we're going to take questions at the end. So while Libby and I are discussing this last question, if you have a question, please put it into the chat and address it, and we will try to get to it. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, but maybe one final question is, I'm curious. You write a book like this, you enter a world like this where people are making profound discoveries about who they are and who they thought they were. I'm curious what you have learned, navigating this world. Has it changed your own concept of family or identity, or, you sort of can't travel through this world without it changing you, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, even if you never take a DNA test, even if you've never heard of a DNA test, these questions that people grapple with as a result of doing DNA testing, these are kind of essential human questions, right? Even if you don't get a surprise, let's say you just take a test and you get your pie chart, and it gives you this access, this immediacy to the past. I think that it informs our understanding of who we are. Particularly if you get a surprise, people are often grappling with these nature nurture questions, right? Like, to what do I owe? Like, what do I owe to my father, to dad, the man who tucked me in at night, the man who sang me songs? He made me my favorite oatmeal, right? What do I owe him? What do I consider him? What do I call him? And also, what do I consider, or call this stranger who contributed half my genetic material, right? And these are questions that we've always thought about long before there was DNA testing. We grappled with questions of, like, what is family? How much is genetics? How important is genetics versus experience and love and intention and all these things? And the people that I interviewed are, like, actively grappling with these questions. I interviewed a woman named Roberta, and that story actually wound up excerpted in the Washington Post. So if you want to read just that little story, you can. It's just look up Libby Copeland Roberta in the Washington Post, Roberta Estes. And she's a lifelong genealogist. And she has this fascinating story about genealogy and genetics and her brother, a brother named Dave. And she sort of grapples with this question of brotherhood, right? What is it that makes a brother, and how important is genetics to that? And how important is it just like the experience of it and bonds that they kind of shared? And I found over and over, you know, everyone answers these questions for themselves. And I always emphasize that because, you know, it's not my experience here, it's other people's experiences that are the important thing that kind of take center stage. But, you know, this question of who am I? Who would I have been if I was raised by that family across the street, right? We all wonder about these things. Like, we wonder where we get these things. And when you interview people who've had the experience of kind of displacement that a DNA testing surprise can cause, and then the shock of recognition at discovering somebody that they're related to, right? Like, and seeing their face in someone else's face. Those experiences they're so evocative and they're so deep that people use similar language to describe them. And I find that absolutely amazing. Like, independently, people use the same language. So when they discover a surprise and they're not genetically related to people they thought they were genetically related to, they will talk about it in language like feeling adrift, like feeling unmoored. I call it the lonely boat metaphor. One woman described it to me as the sense of being cut off and being put on a raft and being put out to sea. But then this sense of like finding their genetic relations, they talk about the sense of rootedness. And they talk about this sense of magnets coming together, which I think is really interesting. But at the same time, and I found this over and over, you kind of can't rank them, right? You kind of can't say which is more important. You can't say, well, biology trumps nurture because it's yes, it's like both, right? And it's a bit of a fool's errand to attempt to establish which is the more. And I think we find that over and over again. And my interviews with people really drove that home, that it's like, it's everything. It's everything. And it's the process of discovery that people find so rewarding. It's like, that's where I might get that. And this is where I might get, this might come from my dad and this might come from my genetic father, right?
Right. I think also it's important to remember as we discuss these things that it is one thing to grow up knowing that you are adopted and that you are not biologically related to your family and they are still very much your family.
Right.
It is another to live your entire life having no reason to believe that you are anything but the biological child of your parents, and then to learn, you know, at 50, 60, I know someone who found this out in her 80s, you know,
Yes.
it's that can be a very different and sort of specific experience.
And I think that has to do with how we construct our stories of ourselves. And I think stories are incredibly important to identity. So when your own origin story is whatever it is, and you can incorporate it into your identity, then everything is cohesive. It's the discovery when you're 55 that your beginnings are different than you thought, that then changes the rest of the trajectory. That's the upheaval.
Very much.
Yeah.
I think I told you this, but I have a friend who just in the last, like in September, he's around 60. He took a DNA test at the request of a genealogical nerd cousin who wanted to have, you know, and they came back not related. And he discovered that he was donor conceived and he had no idea his parents are both dead. But the remarkable thing about that story is he grew up in a family where there were no doctors or scientists, but ever since he was a little boy, he had wanted to be a doctor. And we learned that he became the exact type of physician that his biological father was.
Wow.
And it's just like, it's uncanny.
Yeah.
But, you know, but again, he just always thought, it's so weird that I want to be a doctor and no one in my family is a doctor. And now it's like, well, maybe there's a reason for that. But the first question that I see in the chat was actually I was toying with where to end, but I'm glad that somebody asked it, because this was something that I was hoping we could get to, which is to talk about the criminal justice use of DNA databases. And hopefully you can also speak generally about the, a lot of people are very unnerved about privacy and whether taking one of these commercial DNA tests is foolish because it puts you out there in some way that is not wise.
Yeah. So, so there's, the four major commercial databases, and there's some sort of variance. So the thing to know is that if you're testing at the Ancestry and 23andMe, which are the two biggest ones, that they've basically said, we're not only not open to law enforcement accessing information or coming in and trying to upload a crime scene sample and match it, which they couldn't do, but we're going to actively fight it. And so law enforcement would need to come in with a warrant or a subpoena, and depending on the degree of litigiousness of the company, 23andMe has been very forthright about saying, we will fight it to the extent that we can, right? That is a different sort of scenario than if you are testing at a company like Family Tree DNA, which is the smallest company of the four majors, or if you're taking your information and uploading it to GEDmatch, which is like a third-party kind of open source site. And at those places, there's varying degrees of you're supposed to be able to opt in or opt out. But basically, you're supposed to be in a state where you're agreeing to have your DNA used in this way. So, it's not as if every time you test, then law enforcement is accessing your DNA. We're not in that world, at least not at this point in time. But I definitely understand people's privacy concerns. And if you look at how the Golden State Killer was caught a couple of years ago, and then sort of the origins of this field that's now called investigative genetic genealogy, which has solved over 200 cases at this point, many of them cold cases, many of them homicides and rapes. Those beginnings were, they kind of took place in a world in which nobody was necessarily expecting any of this. And so there weren't terms of service to kind of account for it. And a lot of it happened in a way that it only came out later that it had happened at all, right? And so because of the origins of that, some genealogists and consumers are uncomfortable. Some privacy experts feel in general that this needs to be better regulated. And like everything ever, the technology takes place, the innovation takes place, and the regulation is like chugging behind in like a slow jog, right? So, eventually will there be some sort of regulation? That's a really good question. But there's definitely privacy concerns. And at the same time, you see these serial killers being arrested from 50 years ago. And there's this real split that I've seen from talking to genealogists and average consumers in terms of how they feel about the relative goodness of those two things, right? Protection of civil liberties and privacy, and putting away people who are really bad criminals who've been at large for decades and decades.
To say it is a highly contentious point within the genealogy community would be like the understatement of the century. I would recommend, if people are interested in that issue, I would direct them to the blog of Judy Russell, the legal genealogist, who writes a lot about this, and Blaine Bettinger, whose blog is called, just Google Blaine Bettinger. Blaine writes a lot about forensic use of DNA. So what is I think we have to wrap up, but to end, is there going to be any follow-up? I mean, you've gotten the book, the story in the Post led to all these other stories, which led to the book, which I'm sure now leads to more and more people contacting you, or sort of, is this it, or what's next for you?
I don't know. I still get, for sure, a lot of emails from people who are sharing their stories. And I don't know. I'm still, reading stories and responding to people, but I haven't decided if I'm going to do something else in this vein. I do write about this topic, so I write a regular column for Psychology Today, and opinion pieces wherever I can. And so I don't know. I'm not sure what's next exactly. I thought I would have it all figured out by now, and then this pandemic thing happened.
Oh yeah.
And instead I don't have it figured out, and I haven't left the house in
Right.
9 months. So I don't know.
We're all in the same
Yeah.
boat. I was asked to repeat the two names of the blogs that talk about forensic DNA.
Yeah.
One is Judy Russell. The blog is called The Legal Genealogist. And the other is Blaine, B-L-A-I-N-E, Bettinger, B-E-T-T-I-N-G-E-R. And I'm blanking on what Blaine's blog is
Is it
called.
the genetic
I was going
genealogist?
to, it's your, no, yours, Cece.
Yours is CC and his
just
is
Google Blaine
yeah.
Bettinger blog, and he writes regularly about forensic use of DNA.
I mean, interestingly, so the Golden State Killer case broke right after I sold my proposal. So it was April of 2018. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm adding a chapter to the book. Throughout the process of writing the book, I had to keep updating it because the world was changing. And then I finally put the book to bed in late 2019, and it came out. And just about a month ago, there was another set of really big news in this world, and within the context of investigative genetic genealogy and the Golden State Killer. And I'm now in the process of updating my book for paperback, and I have to report more on that chapter. So it's like, just when you think you're done, I mean, that world is moving so quickly, and it's fascinating to the kind of the privacy implications and the where this is going is one of the most interesting things to watch. I think it's really, really important. So
I do want to say, just before we close, I think it's important that people understand that it's not like if you tested Ancestry, law enforcement can use what you send to Ancestry, and that's not how it happens. It's mostly happening through GEDmatch, which is a site where people voluntarily upload their DNA, and it's public. So I think people need to understand that, like, you don't have to be worried that if you test. The only one that's a little bit different is FTDNA does allow some limited law enforcement use, but anyway. Well,
thank you. Jennifer and Libby, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us. And this webinar was recorded, and it will be up on our YouTube channel in a few days. But all the best to both of you. And again, thank you for sharing your stories and your time with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks
for
everyone.
having us.
Appreciated it.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.
Good to see everyone. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Libby.